Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Young, and I am the Director of QA Engineering at a company called GetWellNetwork, and I am super excited to join the SauceCon agenda today and overall kind of the Sauce Labs community in general. It has been such a tremendous tool for our company and our QA team over the past year or so since we first started using it. And so today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about our recent journey into a true mobile automation testing framework and some of the important lessons that we learned along the way. So I've actually broken up our journey into a few different chapters that discuss some of the key ideas, concepts, strategies that we discovered along the way. And I think this will be helpful for others of you who are either in the early stages of your mobile automation journey or even a little bit further along and kind of comparable to where we're at in our journey as a company. So you kind of see a little sneak peek here of some of the things I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on. But before we jump into that, I do want to give kind of a quick 2-minute overview of my company and what we do, because I think it'll be helpful for you guys to understand some of the automation work that we're doing. So first and foremost, I mentioned I work for a company called GetWellNetwork. We are actually based out of Bethesda, Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C. You can see a picture of our office here on the left. You can also see this is a picture of our CEO, Mike O'Neill. And actually, the way our company got its start is that back in 1999, Mike was actually a grad student at Georgetown University, and he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So obviously a very scary and vulnerable moment in his life. He endured many weeks and months even of treatment. And although he ended up having a pretty great medical outcome, his patient experience during this journey was not as great. And so this was obviously a time before, you had the internet in your pocket with cell phones. And so he really felt as though he didn't have the tools that he actually needed to be proactive in his care. And so he was at Johns Hopkins Hospital, by the way, which is one of the best hospitals in the world. And he still felt as though he didn't have all of the tools that he needed to actually go and beat this thing. And so as he describes it, he had literally thousands of questions for his nursing staff about what he could do while he was in the hospital to go ahead and beat this cancer. And the staff, he would bombard them with these questions. They were busy in their own right? And so they would actually tell him to get on a certain television channel because they had health information that played repeatedly on this channel. And so his first experience with this, trying to, be proactive in his care, was he had a 10-year-old TV on the wall. And he went to turn on this health education channel to learn more about what he could do to beat this thing. And it was actually playing information about breastfeeding. And so that was his first experience, obviously not something that particularly pertained to his health journey. And so he saw this as kind of an opportunity, and ultimately GetWellNetwork was born. So now you can actually see this is a patient on the screen here who's actually using GetWellNetwork, which is our software, and on a touch screen device that actually pulls out in front of the patient and they can touch with and interact with. And then there's also an example of a smart TV on the wall, which is also running our software. And so now 20 years later, if you are one of these patients who's in a hospital or facility that has GetWellNetwork, you have access to a fully interactive experience on your hospital screen that allows you to do so much more than just watch TV. And the whole concept behind this is putting the patient first and making sure they're proactive in their health journey. We also integrate with electronic health records for each hospital and facility. So this allows us to do some pretty cool workflows, which I'll talk about quickly here. So what do we actually do? I want to give you a sense of some of the things you can do through the system. Number one is entertainment. So, of course, watching TV, Hollywood movies, games, internet, all that good stuff is, of course, included. The ability to order meals. So patients, while they're in the hospital, can actually order meals through our interactive experience as well. So instead of, the days where nursing staff kind of hands out pieces of paper and the patient and their family fill out what they want for lunch and dinner, we are automating this whole experience. And we can actually, as I mentioned, we interface with the health record, so we can actually interface with dietary restrictions. So we can say, hey, Josh, you can't order 10 pieces of bacon today for lunch because it has too much sodium and things of that nature. Personalized education and medication. So We have fully tailored and customized care plans for the patients who are in the hospital for any number of reasons. And so this includes things like health videos and actually tailored pathways that teach patients about why they might be in the hospital and what they can do to get better. And another example here is if a pharmacist was to order a new medication for a patient, we can actually pop something up on the screen no matter what they're doing, whether they're browsing the internet or watching a movie. We can actually pop something up that says, hey, Josh, you have a new medication that you've just been prescribed. Do you want to learn more about it? Do you want to learn about its side effects and things of that nature? So again, always trying to keep the patient engaged. Something else we do a lot is room controls. So the ability to control your room temperature, control your room lighting, open and close the blinds on the window and things of that nature. Service requests is another one. So, I can actually let the hospital staff know that, my bed sheets need to be cleaned, or my room's too hot, my room's too cold, and things of that nature. And our system will send that message out to the appropriate staff member at the hospital so they can follow up with the patients. And quite honestly, I could probably spend my entire presentation talking about some of the things we do, but I definitely want to get into some of the good automation work. So I wanted to just give you a sense of some of the things that we do at GetWellNetwork. And finally, just to show you how we kind of came about working with Sauce Labs, I do want to quickly talk about kind of our hardware situation. And so we've always built our software with the goal of being hardware agnostic, in which you could run it on all sorts of hardware and it would essentially function the same way. Up until recently, we've been fortunate in the fact that we've been able to kind of control which hardware hospitals will use to deploy the GetWellNetwork solution. You can see on this screen, we have a number of proprietary devices, various smart TV models, that swing arm touchscreen that I talked about, certain iPad models. But at the end of the day, it was always kind of a set list of devices that were supported and would be used to access GetWellNetwork until this past year, when we actually rolled out our first true BYOD, bring your own device experience. And as you can imagine, by doing this immediately expanded the scope of our development and especially our testing and QA plan to support all these various combinations of iOS, Android devices, operating systems, resolutions, etc. But obviously the benefit of this is that patients now, as they're in the hospital, can actually pull out their own devices, their own phones in their pocket, and use that to do a lot of the same things that we saw on the previous slide. So order meals, change their room temperature, and learn about their care. And so therein kind of lies the beginning of our relationship with Sauce Labs. And this, of course, is a picture of me now. This is my daily routine now. I kind of just sit back and watch all my automation scripts, catch all the bugs, and report them to the devs, right? Well, not quite, but we are getting there. And so far, it's been a really fun journey to kind of figure out various problems and things that we've run into. And so that was part of the reason I signed up for this event. And I'm hoping that, by talking through some of this, we can all kind of learn about this journey together. So at the beginning, when we kind of announced our plans to implement a BYOD solution, we evaluated a couple different potential solutions, and we determined Sauce Labs obviously was kind of the best clear-cut choice for our company to work with. And so before we actually jump into some of the lessons learned, I do want to show you guys an example of a simple automation script of ours that's actually running on a Sauce Labs device. I think it'll be helpful for you to see kind of what our application looks like on a Sauce Labs device. So I'm going to jump out real quick and just show you how we have this set up. And first and foremost, a little bit of background about our automation test cases and test suites. We use this tool called Katalon Studio. And this is where we've housed all of our automation scripts. This is probably pretty comparable to what you guys have seen in regards to an automation IDE, if you guys are using those. But this is where we write all of our automation scripts. And as you can see here, I actually have set up a simple test suite, which we're going to take a look at running on a Sauce Labs device. It's called BYOD_curriculum. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to log into a Sauce Labs device, boot up our application, click through some onboarding and login steps for a patient, and then ultimately run through some curriculum tests. And curriculums in our world at GetWellNetwork is essentially just some simple surveys that patients can complete. So this is just one example of a test suite we've written for Sauce Labs, but I think it's a good example to kind of show you guys. So you can see here, first and foremost, we do have a couple of things set up. Number one, we are running these test suites in a parallel fashion. So with the simple click of the execute button, I'm actually going to be launching this on all sorts of different devices in the Sauce Labs farm. So you can see I have some iPhones, I have some Google phones set up here, I have some Samsung phones set up here. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out real quick is that we also have two different profiles set up. So you can see this first set of 11 tests here is running against our automation profile. And we also have an automation 2 profile as well. And so the second set of 11 is going to run on the same devices as the first set, but it's going to run against a different profile. And this actually allows our company to test out different code bases. So we can test out, our latest and greatest code base that's out in the wild, along with either, an upcoming version of code or even the most recent and last version of code that some people might still be running, just to make sure that all of those different variations are running smoothly. All right, and so I'm not actually going to click execute, but you can imagine that I did, and I am going to show you a recent run from this same test suite here, this curriculum test suite. So I'm going to jump over now into Sauce Labs. And you can see here, I am in my automated test section. This is all of my tests that have recently run on real devices up in the Sauce Labs environment. And you can see here is that BYOD_curriculum test suite that we talked about. You can see it's run across a bunch of different device types, as well as different operating systems here. And so let me just go ahead and open up one of these and walk you through real quickly kind of what the patient workflow looks like. And then we can talk about some of the things that we learned as we developed the script. So I'll go ahead and open this Google Pixel 2 XL. And so kind of to give you a sense of the workflow for a patient, I'm going to click through this rather quickly because I want to have time for the rest of this. But first thing that a patient does when they are, opening up the app in the hospital is they actually have to search for their hospital from a list of states, and then they ultimately select their hospital from a list. You can see here we have some demo environments set up, but these would be real hospitals in real life. And then from there, the patient is actually entering in information about themselves. So first name, last name, date of birth, and all that good information. In our automated scripts, we are using some randomized first names, last names, and date of birth. But again, in a real environment, those would be the real values of the patient's name and date of birth. And then next up is a form of two-factor authentication, which you'll see on the next screen. So either via text message, via phone call, or via email, we are sending a code to the patient that they need to type in to basically say, I am indeed this patient. And so that is something else I'm going to talk about a little bit, is how we got around this two-factor authentication in our test scripts. That was a fun one to figure out. And then from there, the patient is ultimately logged into the GetWellNetwork application. We prompt them with a couple things, do you want us to remember your account for the future, things of that nature. And ultimately they get into the experience. And as I mentioned, our curriculum test suite runs through a bunch of different surveys on the system. So again, we have some just basic, very simple test surveys set up. And this test actually walks through a couple different iterations and different paths through these surveys and makes sure that all checks out. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. You can see it's starting to run through some of these surveys here. And then towards the end of the test case, it simply logs to the bottom of the screen where we have a log out button to get ready for the next test. So again, in a nutshell, that's kind of what one of our simple automation scripts does here. So I'm actually going to jump back over to the presentation, and I want to talk about some of the things that we've learned in building this. So first and foremost, one of the first things we did, even before picking Sauce Labs as a company, was starting to plan and define the goals for our BYOD automation efforts, right? And so this step was arguably the most important part of our journey. Ultimately, we determined that we wanted our mobile automation to accomplish a couple things. Number one, which you can see here, is we wanted to utilize a lot of the existing tools that we were using at GetWellNetwork. We did not want to reinvent the wheel. So, you guys saw we were using Katalon Studio for our automated tests. We're using Jira for our ticketing of our various bugs that we track. We're using GitLab for our code repository and GitLab-CI for our various pipelines that we have in place. And so Sauce Labs was a natural fit for us because, it does a good job of interfacing with all of these different tools that we were already using as a company. Another goal that we had was testing on as many devices as possible, but also prioritizing the most commonly used. So even more important to us as a company than testing on 1 million devices was to actually test on the right set of devices, right? And so we used a lot of the data that we found online to make sure we had a predefined list of devices that were important for our company to test on. We used criteria such as, what are the most sold and most popular devices in the United States, which is our main demographic. We wanted to have, a nice balance of various resolution sizes. We wanted devices running on recent versions of operating systems for iOS and Android and things of that nature. And so again, Sauce Labs was a natural fit here. They had kind of all of the different combinations that we were looking for in our devices. Another goal we had was making our tests as dry as possible. And so, dry in the programming world, of course, is don't repeat yourself. And so as I mentioned, we already had a bunch of automated tests that we had written for various things at our company. And so our intention going into this mobile automation journey was we wanted to kind of tweak these existing test cases. We didn't want to start from scratch and create brand new test cases that were specific to mobile. So we wanted these existing test cases to start to work on mobile devices, similar to how they already worked on a browser environment. Another goal we had was the ability to test in parallel. So we already saw this a little bit when I showed you launching this, but the ability to test on multiple devices at once, we did not want to have to run sequentially. And so obviously Sauce Labs offers this ability based on number of licenses you have, and Katalon also offers that as well. So that was, again, a natural choice. And then, of course, ultimate goals, reducing time to market, so making our testing faster, and ultimately having high quality applications that we release to our patients and our end users. So that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. And so one of the first things we came across was really the need to have very nicely defined mobile objects to use in our test cases. So as I mentioned before, we wanted to use dry techniques as much as possible. And our goal was always to be able to use the same objects against both iOS and Android. We did not want to have 2 separate versions of objects defined, one for iOS and one for Android. We wanted the same object to work across both of those different device types. And so again, we kind of researched industry best practices, also looked at Katalon, Appium, and Sauce Lab recommendations for mobile identifiers. And ultimately what we found was that accessibility IDs were really the best approach for us as a company, and really kind of the recommendation across the industry for a couple of reasons. Number one, it can be defined by the mobile development team. So i.e. it is not defined by the Apple or Google framework. These values are always unique, which is always helpful when defining objects. It's faster and quicker than XPath. So XPath oftentimes has to recursively render the UI hierarchy when defining objects and searching for objects. And so by using accessibility IDs, it tends to be faster in an automated fashion than using XPath. As I mentioned, the same object can be used if you're using accessibility ID. It can be used for iOS and Android in a single object. And XPath is a little bit more brittle than accessibility IDs. So for example, if an object were to move to a different location on the screen in a future iteration of the app, oftentimes this can compromise the XPath and break tests, whereas with accessibility IDs, this is not as likely to happen. So we used kind of this research to define some clear rules and syntax for our various objects and things that needed to be defined in the application. So things like buttons and text boxes. And we ultimately presented these findings and recommendations to the mobile development team. And so again, highly recommend having a good communication with the mobile dev team if you are working in a QA capacity, because it's great to have these types of conversations. And so what we actually discovered during this process of presenting to the developers was that accessibility IDs are also used for voiceover when using iOS accessibility tools. So we needed to start to take that into consideration as well when we were kind of defining this rule set. And so an example of this is if you're a blind user who's using, native iOS or Android voiceover functionality to navigate your apps, it's actually the accessibility ID that's used to determine what the system or what your mobile device will actually read out. And so we needed to start to consider some of that while we were defining our rules and our matrix for our IDs. And so ultimately, we had a round of slight tweaks based on this discovery with our devs. And then from there, we documented all these rules into a master matrix, presented it to our larger development organization as the set of standards for defining mobile objects at our company. And it is kind of the set in stone, although it is evolving, it is kind of the set in stone list of rules that our mobile devs can start to use as they're developing the application. So a couple of benefits of going through this process. Number one, it allows us as a QA team to always know what to expect in regards to object IDs. So we can actually start writing some of our automated tests even before the development's complete, because we know what to expect as far as these different objects that are being built on the screen. And it also led to a lot less back and forth between QA and mobile dev after something's already been developed. So a lot of that communication happened as part of these upfront discussions, and less of it's happening after something's been developed. All right. Lesson number 3 that we learned was the power of pipelines. And so now at this point, we kind of had a plan in place. We had some guidelines for formatting objects, of course, and we really began to use Sauce Labs more and more on a daily basis. And so what we needed to do next was figure out what is the proper way for us to actually upload our application to Sauce Labs for testing. And so this seems like such a simple workflow, but it's helped us out so greatly. And so as many of you know, there's a very simple tool on Sauce Labs that can be used to basically upload your mobile application, either your APK or your IPA file, to Sauce Labs interface. And then at that point, it kind of becomes available for people to use for testing. And so what we found was that at our company, we were releasing versions of our application sometimes multiple times a day, right? And so it would take our QA team was kind of responsible for taking the application and uploading it up to Sauce Labs. And it was taking us about 5 to 10 minutes to get it uploaded every time a new version of the app was released by our mobile dev team. So 5 to 10 minutes obviously does not seem like a lot of time, but when you consider we oftentimes had to do multiple releases a day, it was adding up quite quickly. And at the same time, it was kind of an annoying process for our QA team. And so what we did ultimately with the simple addition of 2 lines of code, which you can actually see on this slide here, is we put in place a simple pipeline that automatically uploaded our application to Sauce Labs every time the mobile development team released a new version of the app to test flight. And so this super simple change, this was probably one of the simplest changes that we did during this whole process, and it's been a huge time saver for us. Highly recommend everyone to check out a similar type of workflow if you don't have one in place. And there's a lot of other really cool CI/CD pipeline work that can be done as well to help simplify workflow, kind of similar to this. All right, next up, this was a fun one, but another situation that we ran into as we started building out our test cases was coming up with a appropriate approach for scrolling on our mobile devices using Appium. So as you saw in the demo, one of the first things that a patient would do is actually scroll a list at the beginning when they open their app to find their hospital. from a list of hospitals. And so what we discovered is that in writing our automated tests, Appium actually uses X and Y coordinates for its scrolling. And so which, due to the fact that different devices have different resolutions, obviously, it ended up behaving differently from device to device because we're defining these X and Y coordinates. And so to combat this, we actually created a few custom keywords, which keywords, in the Katalon world is essentially a custom function in our script that could be used for a couple different variations of scrolling. And so the way these work, you can see a simple example of a vertical swipe here. And the way these work is they actually grab the resolution of the device that they're running on in Sauce Labs, and they actually use those to compute a percentage of the screen size to use for the Appium X and Y coordinates. So it's actually doing a real-time calculation to figure out what is the right X and Y coordinate to put in the test case. And so what this did for us is it allowed us to ensure that our scrolling was always going to perform the same on all these different devices that we were running our tests on that have different resolution types. Another thing that we did kind of similar to this is we found a need to be able to scroll down a list and actually look for a certain object. So instead of us, looping through the scroll method repeatedly, we also created a keyword or a method that would keep scrolling. You'd pass in a object and it would keep scrolling until that object was present on the screen. So another valid use case that was extremely helpful for us. All right, next up, two-factor authentication. So again, as you guys saw in the demo, one of the steps that the patients will take during the onboarding of the application is they have to enter in a PIN code validation to make sure essentially that they are who they say they are. And so since we're going to be, we knew we were going to be testing these on Sauce Labs devices in the public environment, and those are going to change phone numbers based on the device. And quite honestly, we didn't know if we'd have access to use text message functionality anyways. We kind of came up with a little bit of a different solution to complete this two-factor authentication step. And so what we actually chose to do is print out our pairing code for the patient in our application server logs. And, we chose to only do this on test servers, which are, we're using the test servers, obviously, for testing purposes. We don't do this in the real environment, but on these test servers, we're printing out our pairing code in our server logs. And then again, we have a custom function that basically scrapes these logs, grabs that pairing code based on the patient that we're using at the time, and then we can ultimately pass in that pairing code into our test case to successfully complete the login. So, we're still generating a unique code and validating that that works correctly, but we're not doing the true text message end-to-end functionality where you're getting a text message, going to your text messages, grabbing the value, and then coming back into the application. So this allows us to also not leave the application during our test case, which speeds things up a little bit. And so for us, this was a fun one to figure out, but ultimately we came up with a pretty cool solution. All right. Final chapter of our mobile automation journey thus far is the all-important reporting. So Sauce Labs does have some reporting tools that are available through their interface, but we actually chose to go a different direction and actually we'll actually have bi-directional communication between Sauce Labs and our Katalon Analytics API. And Katalon, as you know, is what we were writing our old automation tests in. And so we had a lot of reporting that was already in place for a bunch of those automated tests. And so basically we wanted to merge these Sauce Labs devices that we're running our tests on and all these reports into our existing reports without having the need to go into potentially two separate dashboards, right? We did not want to have to log into Sauce Labs for those results and then log into Katalon for those results separately. We wanted both of them to be available in both places. And so to do this, again, Sauce Labs makes it super simple through their API. And we actually created something called a test listener, which if anyone's interested, I can send you examples of what this looks like. But a test listener in the Katalon world essentially means it runs before or after every single test suite. And so before every single test suite that we run, This listener basically looks at our access key data from our driver and uses that info to determine whether or not the test is running against a Sauce Labs device at that particular time. And so if it does, it also sends that information, the report name, and ultimately the status of the test as well, whether it passed, failed, or errored out. It sends all of that information up to Sauce Labs, and that allows us to have things like the actual test case name appear on the Sauce Labs dashboard and have the results of pass, failed, or errored out also on the Sauce Labs dashboard. And so this worked pretty seamlessly, super simple to set up through the Sauce Labs API, and ultimately allowed us to achieve that goal of having the results available in both the Sauce Labs interface as well as the Katalon interface as well. So we could access, results of our tests in both places. So again, if anyone's curious to see this, I did not include a code snippet of what this looks like, but I'm happy to show some examples if you want to reach out on LinkedIn or something of that nature. So again, these are just some of the things that we've encountered so far. It has been an extremely interesting journey, and it always is. And kind of what we're looking at next. Of course, we kind of plan to expand our test cases to meet additional use cases. Our application is constantly evolving. We also want to improve our CI/CD pipeline to run on a nightly basis and proactively report back our findings to our QA team via email. And so this will allow us to, come in the morning, see a nice email roll up, and see if something broke due to something that was developed the previous day. One additional note here is that early on, we actually did experiment with the concept of having our test cases run every single time a developer tried to check in a new piece of code, and basically not allow them to merge in a new piece of code unless it passes all our tests. And this, we had this up and running, but ultimately what we discovered was that this slowed down the process and the workflow a little bit too much, because the devs and the QAs were oftentimes waiting on these pipelines to finish before they can move forward with either testing or moving on to the next thing. And so hence why we're kind of planning to go with the nightly check approach instead. Another thing we are definitely interested in learning more about and probably implementing here in the near future is the screener tool for visual testing on Sauce Labs. And so for those of you who had a chance to attend the recent Sauce Labs webinar about this screener tool, it looks extremely useful. Although we haven't used it yet, it looks extremely useful. And it's definitely one of the things on our radar and on our list to implement in the near future, to make sure that we're testing some of the visual aspects of our application with each release as well. If you haven't seen the webinar, I highly encourage you to check it out because it looks like a super powerful tool. And that kind of wraps up our journey thus far into mobile automation. Again, it has been fun. We've run into some obstacles and some challenges we had to work through, but it's been an extremely fun journey so far. Hopefully this session was helpful for those of you who are experiencing some similar challenges. I'm also curious to hear from those of you who maybe tackled a problem that we talked about today in a different way. So feel free to reach out, connect on LinkedIn, and I'm curious to hear back from you folks as well. But thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.